One thing that struck me about your book, Eclipse of the Sunnis, is you state very bluntly that Iraq had a civil war and the Sunnis lost.
They did.
And the Christians lost. I don't think that's the way U.S. policy looks at it. And actually, I don't read that in the New York Times.
Sometimes you do.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do. There are people, and look, when you watch the Obama administration and the way that they are dealing with policy on Syria, you feel the ghost of Iraq. They may be taking some of the wrong lessons from what happened there, but they do understand that something went terribly wrong. Iraq was a demographic shift. The majority of the refugees in Syria, and this is another tragedy about Syria. Syria was a place where 2 million Iraqi refugees found a place to be that was safe. Syria is a place that was a home to Palestinians in a way that no other country really was. Yarmouk Camp, a place that has practically been destroyed, for any of you who have seen that remarkable photograph that looks like Dresden, that is the end of an era for Palestinians. They were allowed to go to school, they were allowed to work. It was a real refuge in the Middle East in the way that it's not in Lebanon, certainly not in the occupied territories, not even in Jordan. And that is over. That refugee camp, and it's not really a camp, it's a neighborhood, has been destroyed. The Armenians from 1919 also found a place to be in Syria and raised families there, and all of that is over because of what's happened now in Syria, or certainly over for at least a generation. And that is an even bigger tragedy when you think about it. In Iraq, we empowered a Shia majority. Baghdad, for the first time in its history, became a Shia city. And that happened not really out of policy, but out of what happened with the population. The Sunnis lost, and they were the ones that were forced to migrate. And so now Baghdad is a very different kind of city. And that also plays into what's happening in the region. You know, Syria is really a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians that begins in '79, accelerates over Iraq, because it flips from a Sunni power to a Shia power. And so Syria is kind of the last battleground for these two regional powers to fight it out.
Certainly not a victory for U.S. foreign policy.
I think that policymakers do now understand that. There is a hangover in the region, there's a legacy in the region, and they have to take that into account when they are looking at Syria policy. There was a very good quote in the New York Times by an Israeli diplomat who said that whenever he hears American policymakers talking about Syria, he sees in the room the ghost of Rwanda and Iraq, and I think that's correct.
The bombings that we read about in Baghdad almost on a daily basis are Sunni extremists?
One of the things that has happened is Syria has revived al-Qaeda in Iraq. If you remember the battles in Fallujah, Americans lost more fighters in Fallujah than we've lost any place in many, many years. And that was to quell al-Qaeda, to convince the Sunnis to turn against al-Qaeda, which they did. It was called Sawa. And these were Sunnis who decided that they would be on the side of the Americans rather than al-Qaeda. And things were quiet in Iraq for quite some time. Syria, because it is right next door, and because there were radicals who poured into this fight, has revived the fortunes of the Iraqis. Those who came from Iraq into Syria were able to set up a beachhead. They were able to collect money. They were supported, they got arms, and as they got stronger in Syria, then they could get stronger again in Iraq. So now what you have is a swath of territory between Fallujah and Raqqa in northern Syria that is essentially run by al-Qaeda, and that is a problem that will be with us for some time to come. So now you have two places that are connected. You have what's happening in Iraq is connected to what's happening in Syria.